To the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, the war was meant to be a contest of spirit. They had been raised on the code of Bushido, taught that Seishin, spiritual willpower, could overcome any material disadvantage. They believed that the American soldier was soft, a product of luxury and excess, who would crumble when faced with the cold steel of a bayonet or the terrifying resolve of a bonsai charge. But as the Pacific War ground on, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the black sands of Iwo Jima, the Japanese soldier discovered a different kind of reality. They found themselves facing a force that did not rely on spirit, but on an industrial capacity so vast and a method of destruction so loud that it seemed to tear the very sky apart. It was the American artillery, a god of thunder that never slept, never tired, and never ran out of ammunition. In the early days of the conflict, the Japanese anticipated a war of maneuver. They expected quick, decisive infantry engagements where their superior night fighting tactics and close quarters aggression would win the day. But the Americans brought a different doctrine to the jungle. They brought the philosophy of massed firepower. For a Japanese infantryman hunkered down in a spider hole, the first sign of this new reality was not the sight of an enemy soldier, but a sound. It began as a distant rumble, like a summer thunderstorm rolling over the ocean, but it quickly escalated into a continuous, rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the soles of their boots and into their teeth. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese named the American artillery automatic artillery. They genuinely believed that the Americans had developed a machine that could load and fire howitzers automatically because no human crew could possibly sustain such a rate of fire for so long. They were wrong, of course. It was just American crews stripped to the waist, sweating in the tropical heat, feeding 105mm and 155mm shells into the breaches with a mechanical efficiency that terrified the observers watching from the ridges. To the Japanese officer who had to ration his shells and save his mortars for the perfect moment, the American approach seemed wasteful, almost gluttonous. The Americans would fire 1,000 shells to kill a single sniper. They would level an entire grid square of jungle just because they suspected movement. This was not war as the samurai understood it. This was engineering applied to slaughter. The noise itself became a weapon. Veterans of the Manchurian campaigns against China were used to the sporadic crack of rifles and the occasional mortar thump. But the American barrage was a physical assault on the senses. It was a cacophony that denied sleep, erased thought, and shattered nerves. In the diaries found on the bodies of Japanese soldiers, a common theme emerged: the inability to think. The constant concussive blasts created a pressure wave that kept the men in a state of perpetual shock. One diary entry from a soldier on Bougainville described the feeling of his brain rattling inside his skull, a headache that started behind the eyes and spread until it felt like his head would split open. The sheer volume of noise meant that orders couldn't be heard, men couldn't communicate with the soldier next to them, and the isolation of the foxhole became absolute. Then came the innovation that truly stunned the Imperial forces: the time on target mission. This was an American artillery technique that felt like black magic to those on the receiving end. A fire direction center would calculate the flight times of shells from different batteries, some miles apart, some firing big 155mm guns, others firing lighter 105s. They would stagger the firing times so that every single shell from dozens of guns arrived at the target at the exact same second. For a Japanese platoon moving through a clearing, there was no warning. There was no walking of fire where shells gradually got closer, giving them time to dive for cover. One moment the jungle was silent, filled only with the buzz of insects. The next moment the entire world exploded. A battalion's worth of high explosive would detonate instantly, creating a sudden overlapping overpressure that liquefied internal organs and stripped the trees of their leaves. Survivors of these CHOT missions spoke of a hand of God that simply erased the earth. It created a psychological terror that paralyzed movement. Japanese commanders found their troops unwilling to leave their bunkers, knowing that the silence of the jungle was a lie waiting to be broken by a sudden coordinated apocalypse. As the Americans moved closer to Japan, the caliber of the destruction increased. The naval bombardment joined the chorus. If the field artillery was a drum roll, the naval guns were a thunderclap. The 16-inch guns of the battleships fired shells that weighed as much as a small car. When these shells passed overhead, they sounded like freight trains hurtling through the sky. The vacuum created by their passage was so strong it could suck the air out of a man's lungs. When they impacted, they didn't just dig craters, they reshaped the geography. On islands like Tarawa and Badio, the topography was literally altered by the bombardment. Hills were flattened, coral reefs were pulverized into white dust that coated everything like a ghostly snow. The Japanese soldier, resilient and adaptable, tried to counter this by digging deeper. By the time the war reached Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the Japanese defense had moved underground. They built elaborate tunnel networks, subterranean cities carved into sulfur and limestone, designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit. But even deep underground, the artillery found them. The concussions traveled through the earth. A heavy shell impacting the surface 50 feet above would send a shockwave through the rock, shaking the dust loose from the tunnel ceilings, extinguishing lanterns, and causing men to bleed from their noses and ears. It was in these caves that the psychological impact of the storm of steel truly took hold. The Japanese soldiers were trapped in the dark, feeling the island shake around them hour after hour, day after day. They could hear the dull thuds of the explosions above, a constant reminder of the industrial might waiting for them on the surface. They called it war neurosis, a shattering of the spirit not by fear of death, but by the sheer exhaustion of the noise. The Americans didn't just want to kill the body, they wanted to break the mind before the infantry even advanced. And then there was the divine wind that turned against them. In late 1944, the Americans introduced the VT fuse, or proximity fuse. Before this, artillery shells had to hit the ground or a tree to explode. But the VT fuse had a tiny radio transmitter in the nose. It could sense when it was 20 feet above the ground and detonate in mid-air. For the Japanese troops in open trenches or foxholes, this was the end of any remaining safety. There was no place to hide. The shells didn't impact the mud, they exploded overhead, raining down a cone of jagged steel shrapnel. It turned the foxhole from a sanctuary into a grave. The Japanese high command was baffled. They couldn't understand how the American gunners had suddenly achieved such impossible accuracy, bursting shells exactly at treetop level every single time. It felt as though the air itself had turned against them. This technological leap dismantled the Japanese defensive doctrine of reverse slope defense, where they would hide behind a hill to avoid direct fire. The airbursts reached over the hills and clawed them out of the earth. By the time of the invasion of Okinawa, the typhoon of steel had reached its zenith. The island was subjected to a bombardment so intense that the landscape was churned into a moonscape of mud and metal. The Japanese soldiers, peering out from their Shuri-line fortifications, saw a horizon that was on fire. The night sky was lit not by stars, but by the muzzle flashes of thousands of guns and the arcs of tracer fire. The noise was so continuous that men had to scream into each other's ears to be heard. The concept of silence had ceased to exist. One Japanese observer noted with grim fascination that the Americans seemed to fire artillery at ghosts. They would saturate an empty valley with high explosives for an hour just in case. It highlighted the fundamental difference in the two nations' approach to war. Japan spent lives to save ammunition. America spent ammunition to save lives. The Japanese soldier, starving, holding a bolt-action rifle with perhaps 50 rounds of ammo, looked out at an enemy who could afford to fire a $1 million barrage just to clear a patch of suspected tall grass. It was a crushing realization of futility. The artillery also severed the connection between the Japanese officers and their men. Runners, the primary method of communication when phone lines were cut, simply vanished in the barrages.
Companies were cut off, platoons isolated. This spirit of the unit, the cohesion that held them together, was fragmented by the wall of fire. Officers could not rally men who were deafened, concussed, and buried under landslides caused by the shelling. The grand coordinated banzai charges of the early war became impossible, not just because they were suicidal, but because the artillery broke up the formations before they could even assemble. When the surrender finally came and the guns fell silent, the landscape of the Pacific Islands stood as a testament to this power. Trees were stripped to splinters, looking like broken toothpicks stuck in the mud. Hills had been lowered by meters. The bodies of the fallen were often buried not by comrades, but the upheaval of the earth itself. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise. They had lived inside a drum for years, their rhythms dictated by the incoming fire. The stunned reaction of the Japanese soldier was not just fear, it was a cultural shock. They entered the war believing in the supremacy of the human will. They left it understanding the merciless, crushing weight of industrial mass production. They realized that no amount of spiritual fortitude could stop a 155mm high explosive shell that arrived with the precision of a mathematician and the violence of a natural disaster. The loud American artillery didn't just break their fortifications, it broke the illusion of the war they thought they were fighting, replacing the myth of the samurai with the cold, hard reality of the machine age. This was the lesson etched into the ears of every survivor. The spirit is strong, but steel is absolute.